All right, me. It is the 29th, I think it is. It's a Monday, I know that much. And today I finished reading William Shakespeare's The Merchant of Venice. This is another Folger Library version, which means that it's put on page in a very specific way. The line counts are counted a little bit differently than they usually are for other works. Things like that. This play itself, like other Shakespeare plays, has kind of a weird history in terms of how do we get to this version that we have. I believe this had a quarto that is pretty close to the way that it is presented now. A second quarto was then produced that seemed to be mostly from memory, and therefore was not as good. But then a folio version came out a number of years later that was mostly based on the first quarto, but then also had some aspects of the second quarto that were more well refined, right? So that's that. This, I also believe, was one of Shakespeare's earlier written plays, which then means that we don't get what I think a lot of people consider to be very Shakespearean attitudes towards things. It's more cut and dry in terms of the fact that it is a comedy, and that your characters are not so muddled, I guess is the word I'm looking for, in terms of their aspirations and their attitudes. Your main issues and the backstory of things are not hidden, right? They're pretty clearly spelled out. I take, for instance, the Scottish play, right? In which the Scottish play, there's one of the big arguments that becomes in how you present the Scottish play is the first king that we meet, and I can't remember his name, but is that king a good king? Because one of the things that occurs is immediately is this talk of this rebellion that's occurring in the Scottish play by multiple people, right? We focus on one specific guy, but there's multiple people involved in this revolt, right? And this uprising against the king that then Sir Macbeth that eventually kills, right? And so you're dealing with this issue of, as a person that is then trying to portray this years later, is what does this actually mean, right? Versus this, in which it is very clearly drawn out what the antagonizing factors are, right? The antagonizing factor is the fact that the person that they have taken money from and agreed to a contract with is of Jewish faith, right? And there's a great deal of anti-Semitism that exists, right? I believe, off the top of my head, and this could be completely wrong, but I do believe it was not until the mid 1700s that people of Jewish faith were allowed to conduct business again in England, right? As like by legal standards, that was the law. Now, was that law enforced greatly? Not particularly, but I believe that that was the case, right? and I could have my years mixed up, and I could be speaking out of my ass, but that's that. And so like this play is just inherently about anti-Semitism, or has this where your villain, so to speak, is a villain because he is of Jewish faith, right? And it is viewed as a problem. Yeah, yeah. Especially when you get to the end, and part of the end solution of the play is that Shylock must become Christian. That speaks a great deal towards the entire plot of this play is based around the fact that you have one character who is of Jewish faith, and then no one else wants to interact with him. Yeah, yeah. I'm speaking off a lot of assumptions here, because I'll be watching a performance of this at some point in the near future, either today or at some point here. But I think the first problem I think that you have to come across is, how do you portray Shylock, right? And I say this because characters that are of Jewish faith for this period of time of writing are either portrayed as this very, very direct, very, very strict, very, very greedy character that is a stereotype of prejudices against people of Jewish faith, and then but then you also have this version that is, I think the best way I can describe it is like this minstrelized version of these characters, right? Of where, because people of Jewish faith were also not allowed on stage, therefore you had people of Christian faith on stage in those roles, and then choosing to take that character in a way that Shylock becomes this kind of, not idiot and not the fool, but like comedic overtones to the character, right? And so that's the great question now of, is Shylock meant to be performed in this kind of traditional sense that is a stereotype, or is he a caricature from the existing time period, right? And that's, neither of them are good options, right? Which to me, I think really is the thing of like, I have never seen anyone perform this show, and I very clearly see why. If this was a play not written by Shakespeare, this would be a play that would be very much swept under the rug, I think, in a lot of ways. But because it is by Shakespeare, I think it will continue to live on in two very distinct ways. The first being, it will continue to be performed sparingly by Shakespeare-centric theater companies, right? And that's just because they're going to do it. It's by Shakespeare. They're the Shakespeare company. They're going to continue to do it, but probably not very often, right? I mean, we get new versions of the Scottish play and Hamlet and Romeo and Juliet and Much Ado About Nothing, right? Is that the one I'm thinking of? You get those all the time, right? But this, you're going to see it every couple of years, and then it's not going to be very popular, and then they're not going to do it for another couple of years. The second thing that I think this play will still live on for, and the reason why I read it at this point in time, is because this play also serves as the basis and the background for the musical Something Rotten, which is a very fun musical. I've now have the opportunity to be the stage manager and be the assistant director for it, at a local production, which is fantastic and a lot of fun. But this play kind of serves as this kind of basis or background for Something Rotten, and therefore I think that this play will continue to exist and not necessarily have a revival, but certainly survive because of that. Your two of your characters in Shylock and in Portia are kind of direct rips in a lot of ways, of just the character itself, not all of the how they act and how they interact and things like that. You have a lot of the basic plot is the same. It's about money lending, and right, it's an economic background about money lending and where are we going to get funds to continue these things and continue our lives. You get the multiple marriages. You have the ending scene of in The Merchant of Venice, it's Portia. In Something Rotten, it's B, of one of the women dressing up as a man to play a lawyer to then save in some way your main characters, right? Which in of itself is not it's something that Shakespeare loves to do, right? Shakespeare has done this in a number of different plays in which he loves playing with the idea of cross-dressing, right? And I think I talked about it in a different play as well. Maybe that was Twelfth Night. I might have talked about it in Twelfth Night. Where, because these are all men and boys that are your actors, when you have Portia come on to do this scene of being a lawyer, you have a boy dressed as a girl that is then dressed as a boy who then has to play this part, right? Which is certainly a little more interesting. But yeah. I think that's all I can think of immediately for those immediate connections. Certainly, it's not entirely the same, and there's certainly a lot of parts of it that are very, very different. Yes, there are parts of it that are different, Kat. But yeah. So I think that this play will continue to exist in some form, not because it is popular, but because people feel that it's necessary, right? Which I don't know if there's a truth to that or not. Finally, the second important thing that I think you have to deal with when choosing to perform this play is the question of who is the Merchant of Venice. I think in very easy terms, right? You have Antonio, who is presumably the actual Merchant of Venice as described, because the entire play is about that he is this merchant that at this exact moment in time wants to lend money to his friend so that his friend can get married, but doesn't have the money on him, so he takes out some credit. That credit is against Shylock, who then they sign a contract in which Antonio will have to lose a pound of flesh if the money's not repaid within 3 months, right? And then the underlying plot is then that Antonio, throughout all of this, he had like 6 ships that were out at sea and were expected to return, and then they were all supposed to return a month before the money was due, and then the first 3 sink, and the last 3 then get like postponed and suspended. So yeah, you know, that's your first option. Your second option is Bassanio, I can't even remember the guy's name, who is really in a lot of ways the actual main character that we follow. It's his exploits of his desire to marry Portia. It's a lot of what we follow is following him. Yada, 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 yada. I think the most interesting, but also I think what would be the hardest to pull off, would be making the Merchant of Venice be Shylock. Because I think that there is a very interesting story here that you can tell, that the Merchant of Venice is Shylock, who has this contract signed that he is supposed to be able to take a pound of flesh from this creditor, because he cannot pay on time. And then, because of who he is, and because he is of Jewish faith, and because he is different than what is wanted by everyone else, gets screwed in court, right? The entire thing that ends up occurring is that Shylock becomes so focused on the fact that he was not paid exactly on time, then refuses thrice the amount, so 3 times the amount that he's supposed to get paid, to fulfill the exact terms of the contract, because he really does want to hurt Antonio. And then what ends up happening is then, because Portia then argues that because the contract then says that it is only a pound of flesh and nothing else, Shylock can take a pound of flesh, but he cannot draw any blood while doing so. Otherwise he would then be arrested for murder. Which is very, very, you know, it's a fun little loophole of things and whatnot. It's interesting, it's fun. But if you were to view the Merchant of Venice being Shylock, then he is screwed out of what he believes is rightfully his, because of this massive loophole and tinkering by someone who is not a lawyer, right? And then loses everything, right? Which is this kind of like, I think there's a very interesting story to tell there. I think that would be how, of course, certainly you would have to rewrite massive parts of the play, right? But I think that would be a very interesting version to tell of the Merchant of Venice. Yeah, I think that's it. I think that's for the Merchant of Venice by William Shakespeare, and yeah.